What's going on, y'all? KM Best here. Let's take a look at the best decks to climb in Marvel Snap. Move Bounce has been the biggest beneficiary of the meta as it has shifted in response to Doom 2099. Doom 2099's release was a time of upheaval, I would say, that led to a couple of different striations and changes in the metagame. The major striation that it created was a gap between the decks that could go over the top of Doom 2099 and the decks that could not go over the top of Doom 2099. This is the first order change that happened with Doom 2099. The card comes out, it's very strong in a very mid-rangey way, and so people are dead set on finding ways to go over the top of it. Move Bounce is an excellent method of doing this. Dagger, of course, scales the more full your opponent's board is. USAgent is obviously ridiculous against Doom 2099 decks, and the deck gets to go extremely tall just as a matter of existing. However, it is far from the only deck that is trying to benefit in this way. There are many different competitors for tallest deck right now, but they don't necessarily have to be the tallest to be worth playing. They have to be tall enough to ride, which is to say, they have to be tall enough to beat a Doom 2099. It's just that Move Bounce is sort of the primary version of this. I also think that Move Bounce is a uniquely difficult deck to play. This is not an easy one to pick up and start with. It's not really even an easy one to play, period, let alone just pick it up and start with. I find it very, very difficult to actually order my plays correctly, to get the cognitive load off of myself and onto my opponent. Basically, you're always going to be thinking more than your opponent is, and that's a recipe for fatigue. So it can also be kind of a hard deck to play until you master it over long periods of time. That is one of the things holding Move Bounce back. The other is that there is a recurrent glitch with Madam Web. Madam Web will sometimes crash the game. It has a lot to do, it seems, with her VFX disappearing for whatever reason. And if you are almost always able to get back into the game, but often you will not be able to repeat whatever action it was that took you to remove the VFX from appearing. Because of this deck has a little bit more losses than it probably should, and it's already an extremely high-performing deck. I would describe it as the best deck in the game, despite that bug, because of just how well-positioned it is as the deck that goes the tallest. When it comes to dealing with Doom 2099, this deck is incredibly well equipped to do so. One of my big burning questions for when Doom 2099 came out is how much metagame share it took away over a long time frame from mid-range decks like Venom and Wiccan. Right now, there's a lot of metagame share being eaten up by various Doom 2099 decks, which means there's a little bit less being played of these two cards. Specifically, in this case, we're going to talk a little bit about Venom. The reason Venom is so good into this matchup is because it is a deck that sort of almost like Dagger scales a little bit with how full your opponent's lanes are. Because Hazmat is able to apply across lanes, it's also, of course, a USAgent deck. USAgent is an excellent card against Doom 2099, and not a lot of the good Doom 2099 decks, which is to say the ones that aren't all in on him, are able to afford running Luke Cage, making this an excellent choice. There are a lot of different ways of trying to go over the top of Doom 2099. This deck attempts to go over the top by dragging them down. Long term, I'm interested in if this kind of deck being elite into Doom 2099 heralds bad things for that card outside of specifically Arishem and maybe Scream and Negative. The interesting thing about it is I do think that both this and even potentially Wiccan could match up well into Doom 2099 if they wanted to, which means that mid-range spot that is currently being taken up by Doom 2099 might, over a long enough period of time, end up trending back to the 4/7s. When I went to check stats on Untapped, which I often do as a little bit of a sanity check before I jump into making one of these videos, one of the things that really stuck out to me was just how bad all the Doom 2099 decks were compared to everything that has a good matchup into them. I think it would be very reasonable to describe the meta as extremely focused around Doom 2099, and that's not good for any card when it's that level of primary focus. When we start talking about the decks that go over the top, you'll understand what I mean, because basically every every deck on this tier list has a meaningfully powerful plan into Doom 2099. He has reshaped the meta into one that beats him. That is effectively what's going on right now. There's a spike in Lady Deathstrike. There's a spike in, every card that is reasonable in terms of scaling over the top of Doom 2099. People are playing more Moon Girl. They're playing more Bounce. They're playing more Moon Bounce. They're playing more Discard. All of this stuff. I said Moon Bounce. I meant Move Bounce. I hope you picked that up. There's no secret Moon Bounce deck. But all of this stuff is really depressing the win rate of Doom 2099. However, it is still above 50% in a very hostile metagame. And I think that is worth pointing out. I do wonder about the permanent metagame cycle Marvel Snap seems to be in, which is new card comes out, people play new card, people beat new card goes away, then another new card comes out, people play new card, people beat new card, then the card goes away, and then another new card comes out. I think Doom 2099 is a little better than most of the cards that typically fall into that cycle, cards like Fenris Wolf and like that. But I do wonder if his only real true home might end up being Arishem. If you are an Arishem gamer, this is a staple. There is no argument about it to me. This is an absolute staple, banger card, one of the best Arishem cards we've ever gotten. So good in combination with Galacta that I actually kind of wonder if they didn't nerf it in sort of preparation for these cards coming out. Like, this is a very, very powerful card in this deck, extremely strong. If you plan on playing Arishem, he will almost never be a bad idea to pick up. The thing about Doom 2099 that I'm sort of coming to consider is that it's possible he ends up either second or third in the mid-range 4-drops race, which means if you're going to play him, you need a reason why you'd be playing him instead of Wiccan and why you'd be playing him instead of Anti-Venom. And I think a deck that has a good reason for that, other than Arishem, is of course Scream, which doesn't have a lot of synergy with either of those cards, both of which require a little more dedication than this deck is willing to give. So for that reason, I also think that Scream is an excellent choice in a world where people are playing a bunch of Doom 2099, but also in a world where you just want to play a Doom 2099 deck that isn't all in on Doom 2099, and I think that long term is going to be how this stuff ends up shaking out. I personally am of the belief that the Doom 2099 package does improve the Scream deck in a meaningful way. However, right now, people are really building against this card. And that means that in the short term, it's entirely possible that this is not a good way to play Scream because of the vast amounts of anti-Doom 2099 stuff you're going to run into. However, I am fairly confident that over the long term, much like how when Anti-Venom came out, Ajax was not the best way to play it because there was too much stuff that beat it in the metagame. Every other Anti-Venom deck was playing Luke Cage. That meta is similar to this meta in this context, where I think that over time, this will end up being the right thing to do, but we will have to actually take time to get to it. We've spent a lot of time so far discussing the ways in which you can go over the top of Doom 2099, and we haven't spent enough time talking about the other ways to combat Doom 2099. And I think Clog is one of those main ways. Clog is also a deck that is generally pretty good, but the more stuff plays Doom 2099, the better off this deck is going to be at just being an excellently positioned list. My list is the one that I believe KX4N cooked up, a tempo-y Thena list that I really enjoy playing. There are other Clog lists, but functionally they're all kind of the same deck, which is to say, Clog A lane, Cannonball A lane. We've played decks like this since we were doing it with Professor X, let alone basically every Cannonball deck is this deck. I don't even need to get fancy with it. This is every Cannonball deck. You know what this deck is. You know what this deck does. Go Cannonball, people. You also have some Thena stats. If you want to just be really depressing, you can also play the Magic version of this deck. I feel like this is a deceptively hard deck to play in the sense that snapping with this deck is very tough because it feels very fragile, but if you don't snap with this deck, you basically have the cube profile of like Galactus, where all your wins are 1 cube and all your losses are way more. I have never enjoyed Magic decks. Like, okay, that's a lie. I enjoyed Magic decks when she could work on turn 6 back in the beta. Basically, ever since then, Magic is just a neon sign saying, screw me over, and that is a tough thing to deal with. The fact that it's also in a Clog deck that's sort of difficult to snap means that, like, it's just a recipe for, like, really long games for really minimal cubes. And I think that kind of stuff is just, are you depressed? You might love this if you're depressed. Maybe it'll help you to make other people depressed too. I've been making a lot of mention of decks that are attempting to go over the top of Doom 2099, and let's start talking about the variety of decks that are trying to do that. So, this is Discard. You are undoubtedly familiar with Scornhub .com, and it is typically about what you expect it to be. It's not going to be as big as Move Bounce, but it's going to be a very real, consistent threat. It's going to be a little less vulnerable than 2 Move Bounce's daggers and certain things. The real risk with this card, or this deck, I should say, that is Discard, is you are a very juicy Red Guardian target, and your deck sometimes just doesn't do the things that you want it to do. I have had a lot of Gambits discarding my MODOK when he was one of 6 cards in my hand. I have had a lot of Moon Knights discarding my Dracula when he was one of 4 cards in my hand. You have to have a certain level of tolerance for it, and even someone like me, I don't have a huge level of tolerance for it. I'm going to yell at it, but I will keep playing understanding that that's just going to happen some of the time. If you're someone who gets like actual factual mad, this is not the deck for you, because it does sort of require you to play those 75%ers a decent amount of the time. I had a game that I won playing like a full 25%er Gambit just to hit my swarms because I didn't have any plans other than that could actually win the game. And I think that that kind of stuff is, you have to have a level of tolerance for it. I enjoy playing this deck. This deck is actually one of the main reasons why I think Goon Knight is not a good choice right now, because if you ever match up into that, you are absolutely never going to beat it. There are some other reasons that are more structural, but Goon Knight's not on the tier list for a reason, and this deck is definitely part of that reason. It can go unimaginably tall. It is able to focus target 2 lanes, which is very good against Doom 2099 decks, and it has a bunch of elite stats when things work that is paired with some really, really outsized disruption, where the drawback is sometimes your deck just doesn't function. One of the cool things about a metagame like this that is so predicated on I am going big enough to make sure that I win is that it allows for different types of decks that can sort of pass the check the metagame asks of you. If you think of this metagame as just an are you tall enough to ride check, this is a deck that actually passes that against a vast amount of Doom 2099 decks. This is, of course, the Havok aggressive deck that we've had on and off on these lists for a while. There have been other builds of it here. This is the one that is currently doing the absolute best. I've seen builds of this that are splashing the move stuff with Madam Web. Right now, this one is playing a little bit of a pseudo bounce game plan, but the real upside for playing a deck like this instead of just playing bounce can really be summed up in one card, and that card is Cosmo. Maybe also Red Guardian. But like, that's really what you're gaining playing a deck like this instead of just simply playing bounce. Cosmo, Red Guardian, elite pieces in terms of interacting with what your opponent is doing. They're both extremely relevant right now, or they at least can be. And the upside for playing something like this over a bounce deck is those interactive, unexpected power output cards. I'm putting this list on here over regular Moon Girl, not because I necessarily think it is better, but because I think it is roughly equivalent, interesting, fun, and unique. I don't want you to look at this and say, oh, regular Moon Girl can't be on here, because of course it can. You just probably already know what that looks like. This, I believe, is a Jeff Hoagland joint, and it is looking to do very cool things, copying hammers in addition to the typical point output stuff that a Moon Girl deck has access to. I think it's a nice little cook. I think I enjoy what it's putting out onto the board, and I think, again, in a metagame where the only thing that matters in like 30% of your games is just a numbers check, decks like this can really shine. Of course, I also think normal Moon Girl can do that, but I will note, one change to the normal Moon Girl list, I strongly suspect if you are a normal Moon Girl gamer, you should be playing USAgent at the moment. The stats decks are also fairly reasonable into Doom 2099. I almost think of these as like a spiritual successor to Mid-Range James, or maybe Mid-Range James is like a sort of spiritual successor to them, because this deck's been around for a while. It's been called The Cook for a while, and it just does stats, and it has Juggernaut in it, and you do things with those stats. There's a little bit of a desire on my part to get a Red Guardian in here, but it's hard. It's either Shadow King or Copycat, and I don't like doing that for either of them, but I do really want Red Guardian in here. Generally speaking, what this deck is trying to do is accomplish very cheap Sasquatches, very cheap Mockingbirds, and copy and like sort of pair that with interaction and things that deal with what your opponent is doing. Juggernaut wins one lane, 19 points wins another. That's kind of the recipe here. You of course also have Galacta as a massive points package here. She's not going to do as crazy as she would when, like, if you had Penny Parker ramping her out, but that is, you know, it is what it is. You're giving up the Penny Parker stuff from the Mid-Range James for more pure power output. The deck is, in my opinion, fairly dependent on getting Mysterio. Your best draws always involve being able to do something stupid with Mysterio, Sasquatch, Mockingbird, but you're going to be able to put a lot of points on the board by cheating energy effectively, and the combination of just a good points package and Juggernaut is usually enough to get 2 lanes won in a game like this. Similarly, Surtur is not necessarily a deck that lacks interaction. In fact, Cosmo is a specifically very good card against move bounce, as is Shadow King a decent amount of the time. Surtur is a weirdly good deck into that matchup. I'm not saying it's a great deck into that matchup. There's definitely things that they can do to you that you can't do anything about, but there are some interesting turn 6s when you are a Surtur deck with Cosmo and Shadow King access into a move bounce deck. There's definitely more play there than there is with a lot of other decks for which move bounce is basically on rails, and a lot of that comes down to Cosmo. I'm not saying it's a great option, but I am saying this deck I do think is a little bit underrated in terms of its positioning in the current metagame, because not only is it at least a puncher's chance into messing them up when you have this Cosmo, it also gets to go tall enough a lot of the time to go over the top of a 2099. Even Silver Surfer is building for total point output here, and I think this is just a really strong deck generally that has been mostly forgotten about and probably shouldn't be. The numbers this deck can output are very large. It is able to meaningfully target 2 lanes in extremely powerful ways. Gigantic Brood, Gigantic Absorbing Man, stuff like that is just really strong. The Zabu nut draw with this deck is bonkers. A turn 3 Galacta is one of the strongest things you can possibly be doing in this deck, because it's already a deck that has all the stuff that scales with Galacta. So a turn 3 Galacta is just like, you're not only getting your Brood abs, you're getting your Shaw too. Like, you have an embarrassment of riches. You are just able to do a bunch of truly ridiculous stuff when you have that. And so that's what the Zabu is playing for here, as opposed to like the Killmonger type plan that a lot of other versions of this deck has. This is one that is sort of very equipped to be like, all right, nice Doom 2099, I'm still going to have more points than you. And that's sort of the ethos of the metagame right now, and it's why this iteration of Surfer is playing the way that it does. I've seen some promising stuff from Fenris Wiccan shells, and this is one that I've seen a lot of just generally okay stuff from. I don't particularly think the metagame is right for it. There's a lot of good things you can do with like Negasonic stuff and Priority. There's good things you can do with Wiccan, but it feels like you're just a little light on points for my taste. And so I don't necessarily, I'm not against the idea of doing this kind of deck. I think there's, again, like some really sick stuff you can do with Negasonic, with Gladiator, with Fenris Wolf. But I do think that unless those cards are hitting really relevant stuff, you're going to end up down on points to a lot of the decks that are trying to go over the top right now. Like, I had a game as discard against this list where they blew up my Negasonic they blew up my Dracula with a Negasonic, and they still needed to guess correctly on an Alioth in order to win the game. And it's like, if you're in situations where you get like an absolute monster best possible out of a Negasonic, and you still need to guess correctly on an Alioth, like, that's just sort of indicative of the points that this deck can really lack right now. And I think that kind of stuff is relevant. This deck is a little bit hard up in terms of just raw output in a world where there is a lot of raw output. Speaking of a lot of raw output, 2090 Negative is pretty sick. I am still a believer here. I think if you are a Mr. Negative deck, you want to be playing Doom 2099. I can understand not doing it. Like, you are meaningfully sacrificing the Wong stuff. It is real. But I think long-term, this will end up being an upgrade in the list. I do wonder about the short-term. I've certainly lost to, like, some Wong, Mystique, Ironheart stuff. There's definitely, like, maybe, like, some upside to trying to get that kind of thing back in here. But I think this would be what I would describe as the most well-rounded Mr. Negative build, which is not necessarily a hard thing to be. Being a well-rounded Mr. Negative build, it's sort of like being a well-rounded square. Like, yeah, it is, but also it's a square. And so this is a deck that I like. I think that if I were to play Mr. Negative, it is the kind of deck that I would prefer playing as opposed to an all-in yes-no Mr. Negative. But I understand anyone who wants to just fully invest in being a yes-no Mr. Negative deck, because that's what the deck has been about forever. This is Depression Mill. And it's exactly what it sounds like. All the issues that I have with Depression Clog, I have even more with Depression Mill. This is a deck that is doing things that are less relevant than clogging your opponent, and it has the same sort of general turn 7 slog, hard to snap weakness. I think the only thing keeping this deck afloat is that it actually is a fairly functional mid-rangey deck. It's just right now, that's maybe not the best thing to be. I do think, in addition, I would like to see people maybe experimenting with Lady Deathstrike in this list, and also experimenting with it in Wiccan. Again, Doom 2099, a really prominent threat right now. I personally have looked on Untapped, and I did not find anyone doing that. I think it is potentially useful here. This is the list that has the most plays, and weirdly, the highest win rate over 100 plus games for every mill deck right now. I'm not a mill expert, but I tend to think that in most metagames, you could play mill. You should probably be playing Clog instead. They are constructed in a similar way. And I tend to think that if you're playing Magic Clog, a lot of the time you'd be better off playing a tempo-oriented Clog deck. So I don't think anything about that is untrue right now, unfortunately. Gamer is a high elo player who's sort of been innovating in the Scream space for a little bit. We've had one of their decks on the tier list before, another small Scream list. They have mentioned to me that what they've been doing is cutting Miles Morales for USAgent, specifically to tech against Doom 2099, so do keep that in mind, of course. This is small ball Scream. I think it is quite solid. It gets a lot worse when people know you're playing small ball Scream, though. I, for example, was able to stay against Gamer knowing what his list was because I knew there just wasn't anything big enough in it to win a lane that really mattered. And I think the more that is true, the tougher it is to be this kind of gamer, if you'll pardon the pun. And I think the list is good, and I think if you want to catch people off guard, it's a really phenomenal list at doing that. And I think this kind of deck is smart. It's good to take like an established deck, riff on it a little bit, and then people are going to play around you like you're the established deck, but then you can catch them off guard. That's really good, and I think it is a really smart and clever thing to have done. I also think that now that I've put it on the list, it might be a little bit in danger. Speaking of decks that like literally one dude in high infinite plays, this is Denish Hela, and shout out to Denish, of course. I actually tried to get Denish onto here, but he did not have access to a face cam for the interview. But y'all almost got the Denish interview over here. I think a face cam would probably be required. Let me know in the comments if you disagree. Hela is basically a deck that is built to do one thing, except Denish's build builds it a little bit differently. This is a deck that is gambling. You are pure gambling. And I don't just mean like, oh, you know, where's the Hela stuff going? I mean like, you're playing that turn 3 Corvus. I mean, like, it's happening no matter what's in your hand. You're just doing that, right? You're playing that blink and stuff. It's happening. You're just going to have to deal with it when bad stuff happens. Now, upside, this deck has unique and varied output and is also probably the most resilient deck when you discard your own Hela. Downside, being the most resilient deck when you discard your own Hela comes with the territory when you discard your own Hela a lot. So, like, you know, there's trade-offs here. I've definitely discarded my own Hela in this deck a lot more than in every other Hela deck, because every other Hela deck is built to completely negate the possibility of doing that or minimize it as much as possible. And this deck is just like, look, shit happens. And I think that there's some meaningful upside and downside in that trade-off. This is certainly the list of Hela I would expect to see if you run into someone playing it on ladder. But I will also say that this deck is actually a little more vulnerable than you might think to those lists that are just putting a bunch of power on the board. If you're not getting the Infinite, you're really vulnerable to just like Doom 2099 card Doom. Like, they could actually just beat you on points. Finally, I saw this list and I decided to put it on as an honorable mention. I am not a believer in Doom 2099 Spectrum in the long term or necessarily even the short term, but this list has been performing well enough that I think it's worth pointing out. And the reason I think it's worth pointing out is because this is a list a lot of people who just started the game will be able to build with Doom 2099. Obviously, I don't think you should go out and get Howard for this list. I'm sure there's a million different things you can try instead. But the point here I'm trying to make is that this is the kind of thing that can actually be successful with Doom 2099's backing. It's not going to be very amazing. I think when I checked, this list had about 130 plays in top 10%, about a 52% win rate. But what I will tell you is that's better than any destroy deck I could find. So I do think it's worth pointing out when stuff like this exists and when it is worth considering, because I know so many of the comments on these videos are, I can't play any of this stuff, replacement for Hydra Bob, etc., etc. And I do think that it is worth pointing out that, like, hey, you know, there is a thing. It's not going to be the best deck in the game, but if you just have Doom 2099 and like very few other cards into Series 4 and 5, you can try. And I think it's important that there be decks like this, honestly, I really do. All right, y'all, thank you so much for watching that video. I hope it's going to help you climb in Marvel Snap. As always, please remember to like and subscribe if you enjoyed it. I have been KM Best, you have been phenomenal, and I will see you in the next one.